This presentation tells a story about how the concept of thinking dispositions was developed at Project Zero through a long program of research, a program that led to some surprising conclusions, and eventually to the development of the visible thinking approach that you're learning about in this course. In the broadest sense, the concept of thinking dispositions is an answer to a question that educators have been asking for centuries. How can we teach young people to be good thinkers? The traditional answer to this question is to teach thinking skills. In other words, the idea is that students will become good thinkers by learning the skills needed to do such things as engage in sound reasoning, make balanced decisions, ask deep questions, explore multiple perspectives, and so on. This focus on thinking skills makes sense, as far as it goes. But back in the early 1990s, researchers at Project Zero began to feel that it didn't go far enough. At the time, cognitive science was still a relatively young field, and there were many interesting research studies being done that showed that merely possessing certain thinking skills didn't guarantee that people would use them. For example, studies showed that even when people had the ability to do such things as look for evidence on both sides of an argument, or probe the assumptions underlying a claim, or look beyond obvious solutions to seek creative ideas, they didn't necessarily use these skills at times when it would be appropriate to do so. Project Zero researchers puzzled over these research findings and eventually theorized that 3 elements need to be present in order for people to actually be disposed to be good thinkers at times when it counts. The first element, of course, is actually having the requisite ability. For example, if you want to make a thoughtful decision, you need to have certain skills, such as the ability to look for pro and con reasons for a particular decision option. A second necessary element for dispositional behavior is what we call inclination, which basically means motivation. So, to continue with the example, in order to make a thoughtful decision, you not only have to have certain skills, you have to be inclined to use them. In other words, you have to be motivated to make a thoughtful decision. The third necessary element is what we have termed sensitivity. By that, we mean that in addition to having a skill and being inclined to use it, you have to notice or be sensitive to times when it's appropriate to use your skill. For example, you have to be sensitive to occasions when it's appropriate to make a thoughtful decision. Here's another kind of example. Imagine you have a student who has the disposition to be a careful observer. This student will have some abilities related to careful observation. For example, she might know how to slow down, examine things carefully, look closely at details, and make subtle visual discriminations. Additionally, she will have the motivation to use these skills. She will want to make careful observations. And finally, she will be alert to occasions to actually be a careful observer, whether she's in science class, art class, walking home from school, or any other setting. It's because these 3 elements come together for this student that we can say that she has the disposition to be a careful observer. The idea that thinking dispositions are comprised of these 3 elements, ability, inclination, and sensitivity, may sound good in theory, but in the early 1990s, that's all it was, a theory. So Project Zero researchers decided to test the theory. We devised some activities for young people that helped us see whether these 3 elements were actually present and separable in students' intellectual behavior. Through a series of tests, we discovered that indeed they were. For instance, we found some students who had all 3 elements in abundance. Some students who were motivated to think in certain ways but didn't recognize occasions to do so. Some students who possessed certain thinking skills but lacked the motivation to use them, and so on through the various combinations of the elements. Naturally, once we were able to identify the contribution of each of these elements to students' intellectual behavior, we wanted to know where the biggest shortfalls were. Was there any particular element that tended to be missing most often for students? Here's where we found the surprise. It turns out that much of the time, when students lack certain thinking dispositions, it's not because they don't have the right thinking skills, and not because they don't have the inclination, but rather because they don't have the sensitivity to occasion. In other words, people often don't think well simply because they don't notice times when it makes sense to do so. So this brings us back to the question of how best to teach thinking. It suggests that an important and often overlooked element of teaching thinking is to help students develop sensitivity. That is, help them to notice occasions when it's appropriate to use the thinking skills they have. The challenge of how to cultivate this kind of intellectual sensitivity is a very big challenge, and Project Zero certainly doesn't have the full answer. But the visible thinking approach, and in particular the idea of thinking routines, is meant to offer a partial answer. Thinking dispositions, by definition, are habits of mind. They are frequently repeated patterns of activity that people develop like any other habit by regularly engaging in certain forms of behavior until those behaviors become routine. This is where the idea of thinking routines comes in. Thinking routines are short, engaging patterns of intellectual behavior that are highly transferable across contexts. They are designed to be easy to use, easy to remember, easy to transfer, and to be vividly effective when used on a wide variety of topics. The idea is that when thinking routines are used frequently in instruction across subjects and topics, students will learn to use these routines as a matter of course. In other words, they will develop the habit of engaging in the patterns of thinking the routines promote. So there you have it. That's the short version of the story of how the concept of thinking dispositions was developed at Project Zero, how it led to the surprising finding about the challenge of sensitivity, and how thinking routines became a key idea behind the visible thinking approach.